Whoops. Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time is an adventure game developed by Ubisoft Montreal back during their golden years. It was during this time that the Montreal team would develop the Sands of Time trilogy. There are other Prince of Persia games that came before and after this trilogy, but when someone brings up Prince of Persia, you're probably going to think of one of these three games. The Sands of Time in particular is actually sort of a reboot of the original games, and is allegedly getting a remake somewhere in the future. Allegedly. Maybe. The game actually did so well that it kind of led to the creation of the Assassin's Creed series, and it was actually originally supposed to be called Prince of Persia Assassin. The game itself is pretty simple. You play as the unnamed Prince of Persia, who, after making an extremely gargantuan mistake, sets out to correct his mistake, using nothing but his trusty sword and his dagger of time, and an inhuman amount of agility. But before we can play the game, we need to prepare it first. Unfortunately, that's easier said than done. Playing the GOG version of the game, it works mostly fine out of the box, but if you want it set up like I do, that is with widescreen support and a working Xbox One remote, you're going to need to do a few things first. First, you're going to want to slow the game's frame rate down to about 60 FPS. If you don't, things might start acting a little goofy. At least it did for me. Use whatever method you'd like for this. You're going to want to download this widescreen fix folder. It's nothing too complex. All you have to do is just move the files from there into your main game folder. One of the contents of this folder is an INI file, which will let you change your resolution and your FOV multiplier. I've put a link to this folder in the description below. I've also put a link to the next thing you'll need, which is this thing called Xinput. Basically, all it does is spit out a file that makes it so the game can read your controller. Once you've downloaded it and run the program, you'll want to follow these instructions so you can get your controller working. Except, running the program is only half the battle. The instructions I took a screenshot of tell you to rebind the triggers and the options, but if you want to rebind any of the buttons and the options, you'll need to figure out how. If you want to rebind any of the buttons, you need to hold down the button you want to use, and then, using your mouse, double click the action you want it bound to. It took me way longer than I'd care to admit to figure this out, but it works. Unfortunately, you still can't pause without using the escape key, so don't break your keyboard in half or something once you're done rebinding the controls. And that's it. After all that, we're ready to start the... Oh yeah, so the fog doesn't work very well on modern systems. The best way to get around this is to, just turn it off in the settings. But if you really want the fog for some reason, I'll leave a link to the PC Gaming Wiki article for this game. And that covers everything I've done to get my version of the game running. If you have some more unique issues, or if you need to see those instructions again, the wiki article should have you covered. Now, we finally get to talk about the game. Starting with the game's visuals, there's a lot that the developers got right. This game came out during a rapid increase in graphical fidelity, and it loves to show it off. A lot. Cloth physics aside, there's a lot of style in the game's environments as you traverse them, from the more grounded locations to the otherworldly. And since you'll be spending about half the game clambering all over these environments, it makes sense that they were given the care and detail that they have. And sure, even though most of the levels are basically just the palace, the game keeps it fresh often enough to imbue a real sense of progress. There's also a large sense of scale to some of the areas you visit, and the level of detail doesn't really go down that much when things get bigger. It's fun to explore around, and there's definitely a few memorable set pieces. The environmental effects look nice, at least the ones we can see, and the water especially looks good. We'll get to how important water is in a bit. Let's narrow the scope and look at the character models. The prince himself is obviously the star of the show, which makes sense given that the entire game is named after him. A lot of care was put into the prince's outfit, and even though his hair's a bit floppy, there's a lot of cool physics attached to his clothes. It looks like what you might think a Prince of Persia looks like, and to top it off, the outfit will get more and more shredded the further into the game you get. I just thought it was neat. There's not a ton of games I can think of from that era that do something like this. The other character models look fine, I guess. The enemy models aren't anything to write home about, and the only other human character in the game, Farah, looks alright. One thing I will say is that the animation work is good across the board. Starting with the prince, the work done on his animations is exceptional. They all flow together very nicely, and it adds a lot of style to the gameplay's substance. The enemy animations are also well done. They're weighty, but they give you enough time to react. I also want to point out the facial animations. They're nothing to write home about, but they hold up surprisingly well for a game that's old. Of course, Half-Life 2 would blow it out of the water a year later, but that's neither here nor there. The pre-rendered cutscenes also look fine, but there's something, fast-paced about them. Like, a character will be doing an action, and his movements will be just a bit too quick. Stuff like that. Let's move on to audio. I have mixed feelings about the audio, but we'll start with the good. And you know what's good? The soundtrack. It was done by Stuart Chatwood from the Tea Party, and they make music similar to the stuff that's in-game. The soundtrack uses a lot of overdriven guitars, mixed in with some Middle Eastern / Indian melodies and instruments. I think Stuart and his team did a really good job, because the soundtrack adds a ton of atmosphere to the game. Music will generally only play during combat or cutscenes, which is a bit of a bummer, but at least the game has a decent enough ambient soundscape. Now, this game isn't free from the stock sound stink, especially when you hear the sound effect. However, everything sounds appropriate at least. And you know what? As long as it's not grating, that's fine by me. Okay, now we need to talk about the voice acting, or rather how it's played back. I actually really like the voice acting, death rattles notwithstanding. Quick tangent, I always thought the death noises that the prince makes in this game are kind of darkly comedic. Is that weird? Anywho, like I said, I think the voice acting is great, but my issue is with the positional system they use. See, a speaker's volume is relative to its position from the camera. For controlled areas, such as the prince's narration and the in-game cutscenes, this isn't that big of an issue. The problem becomes apparent when you have control of the camera. The game doesn't really account for where your camera might be before it decides to start playing dialogue, which means you can miss some of it.
Where are we? This was the Sultan's zoo.
Be careful. Last time you were out there.
It's not great, but you're not going to miss any of the crucial story beats, so it could be worse. My only other issue is how loud some of the sound effects can be mixed in, especially this puff of air sound effect that plays when you get a life upgrade. You know what doesn't sound bad? Drinking water. I dare you to name a game that makes you thirstier than this one. There's a sort of reverence placed on water in this game, and you can heal off of any water source you can access. Even if it's this dirty, gross bathwater that you're standing in. You'll also find the best water at the previously mentioned life upgrade stations, which permanently extend your life bar. Life upgrades are one of two collectibles / upgrade things you can get throughout the game, the other being your sand tanks. Now's probably a good time to explain how that whole Dagger of Time thing works. Just a little bit after starting the game, you'll get access to a thing called the Dagger of Time, which grants you abilities that are powered by the Sands of Time. These sands are stored in sand tanks, and you start with 4, although this will go up pretty quickly as you explore the palace. You can drain these sand tanks to power abilities like Recall, which lets you rewind time and is probably one of the more iconic abilities. There are also other abilities with varying degrees of usefulness that I'll get to in a minute. But first, let's move over to combat. Combat itself is pretty simple. Maybe a bit too simple. So here's how it shakes down. You attack an enemy with your sword, and they eventually go down. And when they go down, you have to finish them off with your dagger or they'll get back up. My problem with the combat is that there's not really much variety outside of picking a target and mashing the attack button. You have a parry, which I cannot for the life of me consistently nail, and you also have environmental attacks, such as jumping off of enemies or the walls. And sure, the combat's flashy, but I think that's all it is. The sand powers could theoretically help with this, but only a couple of them have any real utility. I still think combat is fun, and that's probably because of how the game presents it, but for the most part, I wouldn't really call it challenging. Farah will also participate in battles. Sometimes she helps, sometimes she hinders, and you have to defend her, which really isn't all that challenging either. So how are your sand powers in combat connected? Well, every time you finish someone with a dagger, you'll refill one of your sand tanks. On top of that, if you kill enough people with the dagger, you'll get a new combat sand tank, which can also be replenished by taking someone out with the dagger. You can use one of these combat sand tanks to not only slow someone down, but also expose them to a 2-hit instant kill. If you have as many combat sand tanks as you do normal ones, you can also use all of your sand to use this ability that basically lets you kill everyone in the area. This can be helpful later, as there are a couple of areas I would actually consider pretty challenging. You also have this haste ability, which is supposed to make everyone except you slower, but it kinda just makes everyone slower. When you're not fighting, most of your time will be spent running around the environment. There's a couple of puzzles in the more traditional sense, but a lot of the puzzling elements come from trying to figure out how to navigate the environment and its many traps. It is pretty satisfying to jump off of stuff and do wall runs, and wall running in particular changed how I looked at sloped walls as a kid. There's a nice wide cushion underneath you too, which allows the developers to make the environment more challenging. Although if you're not careful, not even recall can save you. Traps and enemies aren't the only things trying to kill you. This game has a pretty aggressive camera as well. The camera likes to use a lot of cinematic cuts and close-ups during the action, but it'll also spend a lot of time fighting you, the player. I wouldn't exactly call the camera a hindrance, but it's certainly not going to do you any favors. The game also frequently likes to use the camera to sort of preview an area. Even after collecting every single item in the game, it only took me about 5 hours to beat, so the camera preview thing didn't happen often enough for me to be bothered by it, but it does happen often. The game also likes to show you what's up ahead whenever you save at one of these sand pillars, and although most of it is meaningless gameplay footage, some of it is used to add intrigue to the narrative. And before we talk about the narrative, I want to go ahead and drop a spoiler warning, since the game's not really long enough to justify having story and spoilers separate. And if you want to avoid spoilers, go ahead and use your dagger of time to fast forward to about here. Don't worry, we'll be there when you get there. Okay, so the story is pretty simple. It's about a love triangle between a boy, a girl, and a dagger. The boy and the dagger are committed to each other, but unfortunately, the girl just can't help but put herself in between the two of them. Okay, let's back it up. The game starts with the unnamed Prince of Persia beginning his narration. He says he has a story to tell, and that story begins with the invasion of a city-state in India. You're there to pick up some treasure, with some help on the inside from a man only known as the Vizier, who has his own reasons for helping you. The reasons being getting his hands on the Dagger of Time and the Sands of Time. However, one thing leads to another, and you end up with the Dagger of Time. This doesn't stop the Vizier from tricking you into opening the Sands of Time, which basically turns anyone who's near it into a sand zombie, unless they have some sort of artifact on them. It's unclear why the Vizier needs the dagger, but the prince is committed to keeping it away from him. He's also committed to making his way back to the hourglass so he can correct his mistake. Along the way, you run into the princess of the king you just robbed, and she seems to be protected by the necklace she's wearing. Her name is Farah, and she and the prince have a pretty interesting relationship together. The prince is openly condescending towards her and even mocks her behind her back, while Farah sort of puts on this innocent and sweet attitude, even though she's probably just using the prince to get the dagger for herself. They love to hate each other, and a large part of the story is them just riffing on each other, and the prince talking to himself as much as he hates it.
Oh, have you been waiting here all this time? I didn't realize you meant these baths. I went to the other baths, clear across the other side of the city. I had a lovely wash and a rub with fragrant oils. Too bad you weren't there. Stop talking to yourself!
I love this back and forth in between the prince and Farah, and I think it adds a lot of charm to the characters.
Look, a crack.
Wait, let's see where this corridor goes. Alright, you can take the crack.
Eventually, they start to actually fall in love with each other, and even though Farah still has eyes for the dagger, and the prince just keeps relentlessly mocking her, they seem to be genuine about it, even if the prince has to justify it to himself first.
I could marry her. After all, she is a Maharaja's daughter. A conquered one, but still. Her blood is royal. Besides, what better way to tame her insolence? It's not so bad for a woman to have a little spirit. It's a challenge!
Alas, before they can build an incredibly healthy and emotionally stable relationship together, the prince fumbles at the finish line and decides not to trust Farah when they make it to the hourglass. They end up in a tomb together, and after an uncomfortable amount of darkness and heavy breathing, the prince wakes up in what I can only assume is a dream world. After dreaming himself into a bath with Farah, he wakes up to find that not only is his sword gone, but the dagger is gone as well, Farah having run off with both. To her credit, she does end up making it pretty far, but she also stumbles at the finish line and ends up sacrificing herself in order to ensure the prince can complete the mission. This sends the prince into a frenzy, and he finally closes the hourglass, which sends him all the way back to before the invasion. He makes his way to Farah's room, and we find out that he's actually been narrating the entire story to her, which I thought was a pretty cool twist. Anyway, the vizier shows up to finish the job before, well, the job needs starting anyway. He attacks the prince, and the prince is forced to kill him. This ends up being a colossal mistake later, but that's for another game and another video. And that's basically how the story goes. There's not a lot of it to talk about, and the game has always thrived more on its atmosphere anyway. The Sands of Time is an exceedingly well-paced action game with a lot of heart put into it. It won't take you more than an afternoon or two to beat, but I think it's well worth the $10 it usually goes for, or sometimes even cheaper if it's on sale. And that about wraps it up for the Sands of Time. I want to cover all of the games in the trilogy, which means up next is the kinda divisive edgelord black sheep of the group, Warrior Within, which I personally love, so be on the lookout for that. Hopefully it'll be out soon. Anyways, thanks for watching. Until next time.